Startup studios have been around for over 20 years. In the mid to late 90s, Idea Lab was one of the first startup studios of any significance, and they are still operating today. But more recently, we have seen a resurgence in startup studios in the last couple years. What's with the story with that? Why are studios all of a sudden seeing an increase in popularity?
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting story in my opinion, but I'm also a huge nerd about this stuff, so I think it's interesting. So yes, Idea Lab was the first studio that started in 1996. Pretty much didn't become popular at all until the mid 2000s. So a number of studios then started to pop up around the years of 2008 through 2012. That included BetaWorks, Atomic, Expa, Human Ventures, Science, the list goes on. And at the time, most of those studios were founded by folks that have already made a ton of money in venture capital. They had successful exits. I mean, Expa, for example, was founded by Garrett Camp, one of the co-founders of Uber. The team at Science had an incredible track record prior. The team at Human Ventures had an incredible track record prior. So studios popped up as basically in that second, you could even call it the first big wave of studios. They popped up as an expression of the GP's interests, which was, I want to go build a bunch of startups again and do it in a portfolio-like capacity. Okay, great. And they already had an easy access to capital because they made their investors a lot of money with their last exit. So they popped up a studio. There was no set way to do it. It was just, let's go build a bunch of startups and call it a portfolio. And it worked really well. And we've seen some incredible case studies come out of that. Like Dollar Shave Club, for example, was it was the first unicorn to come out of a studio, and that was at Science. A couple of years later, VCs mostly around the world started to catch wind of this, and that led to the second big wave of studios. Second big wave of studios popped up because now that there were some early case studies of success here, folks started to see this as a really lucrative means of building great ventures and doing it cheaper. Now, on the other hand, something to look at in the broader environment between the years of maybe 2015 through 2017, it became way, way, way cheaper to build startups. The cost of capital was cheaper. The cost of equity was cheaper. So the ability to spin up a landing page and write some code just became faster and cheaper and easier to do altogether. And so studios popped up as a result of that. And we've seen investors like Chris Sacca, for example, even tweet about this at times, mentioning that the cost to build startups has never been lower. The speed to build startups has never been faster. And so studios popped up largely in reaction to that. So now we're looking at the years 2017, 2018, and we've got about 100-ish studios around the world, and they all look different. And quite frankly, they still all look different, but that's a problem that we're seeking to solve right now. So they all look different from a fund structure standpoint, a thesis standpoint, a strategy standpoint, and to some extent, that's really good. But to the other extent of how do we explain this model to LPs, the people who hold capital, that's really bad. And so that was the big reason for GSSN in the first place to form. And then other organizations have since popped up to do similar work, which is let's bring some community, take the consortium approach to this model so that we can proliferate the growth of more studios. Well, COVID hit, and now all of a sudden we've got an abundance of problems all over the world that need to be solved. More problems than we know what to do with. And we don't really know how to solve them. We also now have access to working with entrepreneurs and investors all over the world as well over Zoom. And that's okay now. And we figured out how to do that. And while that's still uncomfortable for a lot of folks and we're figuring it out as we go, it's working to some extent. And so even since COVID hit in the last 15 months, we've seen an incredible boom of studios because now there's way more access to capital, way more problems to solve. There's more capital that's just flowing around in the first place. And we're seeing studios as a much more prescriptive approach to solving problems, meaning less risk. And less risk means theoretically higher returns. And so this is not only a better means of building companies and having great returns, and the early trial test data, quote unquote, is now out to back that up. We can get into that if we'd like. But it's also a model that looks like the best model that we have right now to solve the world's most pressing problems. because of how much risk it reduces. We would create widgets on an assembly belt. You do the same with startups. And that means, okay, for days 1 through 14, we do this, and we seek to hit these goals, these metrics. If we don't succeed at that, kill it, move on to the next.